The desert sun hung high in the sky, painting the wide-open land in shades of gold and brown. The wind whispered through the dry grasses and cacti, carrying the distant cries of hawks circling above. Life here was harsh, shaped by the unrelenting sun and the harsh, rocky soil. Yet, amidst this unforgiving land, small communities had learned to survive, moving with the rhythms of the seasons and the land itself. One such community was a small Apache village tucked along a narrow canyon, where families lived in harmony with the land, hunting and gathering, and raising children with knowledge passed down through generations. Among the villagers was Nayeli, a young Apache woman with eyes as sharp as a hawk's. She had grown up learning the ways of her people, how to track animals, how to read the winds, and how to protect herself in a world that could be unforgiving. Nayeli was quiet and thoughtful, but beneath her calm demeanor burned a fierce determination. She was respected in her community not because she shouted the loudest or acted the boldest, but because she carried herself with quiet confidence and courage that others could not ignore. The peace of the village, however, had always been fragile. Outside the canyon, settlers were expanding their ranches, claiming land that had belonged to the Apache for generations. Tensions had grown over the past few months, with whispers of disputes and small skirmishes reaching the village. The Apache had long understood that these newcomers often came with more than words. They brought guns, wagons, and plans that could uproot lives. Still, the villagers tried to keep to themselves, avoiding trouble whenever possible, trusting that knowledge and patience could outlast aggression. It was late morning when the distant sound of hooves reached Nayeli. At first, she thought it might be a messenger or a neighbor, but as the sound grew louder, dust rose on the horizon, and a group of men appeared, riding quickly and with purpose. Their faces were set hard, eyes cold. These were not travelers seeking directions or simple trade. Nayeli's heart tightened as she watched them approach, recognizing the danger immediately. She turned to warn the others, but before she could reach the village center, the men had dismounted. Their movements were swift, practiced, and merciless. The leader, a tall man with a stern face and a sharp voice, barked orders. Nayeli tried to stay calm, but the fear in the village was palpable. The men began tying ropes to her arms, pulling her toward the wagon they had brought. Nayeli struggled, but there were too many of them, and the ropes bit into her skin. She realized then that she was being taken as leverage, a pawn to intimidate her people into surrendering land or resources. Her mind raced, thinking of her family, her neighbors, and the knowledge that she had to survive. As she was lifted onto the wagon, she noticed the reactions of the villagers. Some were frozen, too shocked to act. Others whispered, fearful of retaliation if they dared intervene. Nayeli's chest tightened with anger and fear, but she forced herself to focus. She knew panic would only make things worse. Quietly, she studied the men, memorizing their numbers, their weapons, their positions on the wagon. Her mind worked quickly, seeking any opportunity for escape. She understood that brute strength alone would not free her. She would need cunning, timing, and perhaps an unexpected ally. Farther along the edge of the land, Elias was checking his cattle. He was a quiet man, known in the region as someone who kept to himself. His ranch was modest but respected. He didn't boast or cause trouble, preferring the rhythm of his land to the chaos of human conflict. Yet, as he noticed the dust cloud in the distance and the figures moving toward the village, a knot of unease formed in his stomach. Something about the scene drew his attention, a small voice in his mind urging him to look closer. He rode closer slowly, careful not to reveal himself. From his vantage point behind a cluster of rocks, he could see the wagon, the bound woman, and the group of men laughing as they pulled her along. Elias's eyes narrowed. There was no doubt in his mind that the woman was in danger. His instincts told him this was not a situation to observe from afar. He had always avoided confrontation, believing that life was best lived with minimal conflict, yet here was a wrong that could not go unanswered. Elias dismounted and surveyed the terrain. The desert worked in his favor. The canyon created natural barriers and paths that could be used to his advantage. He considered his options carefully. Direct confrontation would be dangerous. The men were armed and clearly experienced. But the terrain, his knowledge of the land, and the quiet resolve burning within him, offered possibilities. He could not let fear dictate his actions. Nayeli's life and the respect of his own conscience depended on his decision. As the wagon moved forward, Nayeli's mind remained sharp despite her fear. She watched Elias from the corner of her eye, noticing the figure observing the wagon silently from the rocks. She couldn't read him entirely, but there was something in his posture, the way he stayed hidden yet attentive, that hinted at careful planning rather than reckless intent. A flicker of hope sparked within her. Perhaps she was not entirely alone. The men riding with the wagon were too confident in their control. They underestimated the land, the knowledge of someone who understood the desert, and perhaps most importantly, the courage of a quiet man who refused to stand by in the face of injustice. Elias moved with precision, using the sun and shadows to conceal his approach. He watched the wagon's path, calculating the best way to create a distraction without putting Nayeli at greater risk. Each step was deliberate, measured, a dance of patience and strategy. Inside the wagon, Nayeli stayed calm despite the ropes cutting into her wrists. She thought of her ancestors and the lessons they had passed down, the value of observation, the importance of courage, and the power of intelligence over brute force. She noticed the gaps in the men's attention, the moments when their confidence made them careless. She silently promised herself that she would act the moment an opportunity presented itself, but she would wait for the right time. Impulsive action here would be fatal. Elias waited for the dust to rise from the path ahead, signaling a bend in the trail where he could act. He knew he had only one chance to get it right. His mind was calm, focused, moving through possibilities faster than the desert wind. In the quiet of the canyon, time seemed to stretch, each second filled with tension, each breath heavy with anticipation. He could feel the weight of the moment, not just for Nayeli, but for the justice of right over wrong. The wagon continued, its wheels crunching over rocks and sand. Nayeli shifted slightly, testing the ropes, finding the small slack that could make all the difference. Elias's presence gave her hope, though she remained alert, watching for signs that the men had noticed him. The desert, with its vast openness and narrow passages, would either be their ally or their trap. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon walls, Elias made his move. Not yet rushing into confrontation, he first needed to create a distraction, something that would split the attention of the men and give Nayeli a chance. Every element of the landscape, the rocks, the dust, the path of the wagon became part of his plan. The quiet rancher, who so often preferred to remain unseen, was now poised to challenge injustice with patience, courage, and strategy. Nayeli sensed the shift in the air. She felt that change in the wind, the slight movement of the shadows, and the knowledge that someone watched with intent. Hope flickered brighter in her heart. She was not powerless. Someone had seen her struggle, and they were planning to act. Her mind raced with possibilities. Each choice weighed carefully. She knew the moment to act would come soon, and she would need to be ready. The part ends with Elias preparing to execute his plan, the wagon rolling forward, and Nayeli's quiet resolve building. Both were poised at the edge of action, one ready to intervene, the other ready to seize her chance. The desert seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to witness the courage of a quiet man and a brave woman who refused to be broken. The sun had climbed even higher over the desert, turning the land into a shimmering sea of gold and brown. The heat made the air waver, and the distant mountains appeared like mirages on the horizon. Nayeli sat on the wagon, her wrists still bound, her eyes sharp and alert. Every movement of the men, every sound of their voices, was noted in her mind. She had learned long ago that in a dangerous moment, even the smallest detail could make the difference between survival and harm. Elias crouched behind a cluster of rocks, observing carefully. The men were confident. Too confident. They laughed and joked, thinking that the woman tied to the wagon was powerless, and that no one would dare challenge them in the wide desert. Elias knew this confidence was their weakness. The men were skilled, yes. But overconfidence often made people careless. That small gap could become the opening he needed. He began with a subtle distraction. Using his knowledge of the ranch and the animals he raised, he caused a small stampede of cattle to break loose from a nearby pen. The dust rose high into the air, the loud noises startling the men and forcing them to pause. They shouted and tried to corral the animals, their attention split between the moving herd and the wagon. Nayeli's eyes widened as she realized something was happening. Her heart beat faster, not with fear this time, but with hope. Seeing the confusion he had created, Elias moved closer, carefully and quietly. Every step was deliberate, his movements calculated to stay out of sight while positioning himself to help Nayeli. He had no intention of fighting these men directly. He had learned that cleverness often surpassed force. He studied the wagon's path, noting the narrow turns in the canyon and the places where the men could easily be trapped or slowed. Nayeli felt a small shift in the air as well. She noticed Elias moving, careful and deliberate, and she realized that he was planning something. Though she could not yet see him clearly, her instincts told her he was not just an observer. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, preparing for whatever chance might come. Her wrists ached from the ropes, but she refused to let discomfort cloud her focus. As the wagon reached a bend in the trail, the men's attention remained on the stampeding cattle, giving Elias the opening he needed. He shouted suddenly, throwing his voice toward the opposite side of the canyon. "Hey, over here!" he cried. The men turned toward the sound, their eyes narrowing as they tried to locate the source of the noise. In that brief moment, Elias moved swiftly to the wagon. Nayeli's eyes widened as he appeared beside her. Without hesitation, he cut the ropes, binding her wrists. The cords fell away, and for the first time since the men had taken her, she felt the freedom to move. She rose carefully, her mind focused on the next steps. There was no time for gratitude or questions. The moment required action, and she understood that perfectly. "Quickly," Elias whispered, nodding toward a narrow path along the canyon wall. "This way, and stay low." Nayeli nodded silently, trusting him despite knowing little of this quiet man. Together, they moved along the edge, careful not to be seen by the men who were still distracted by the commotion of the cattle. Each step required balance and precision, as one wrong move could alert the captors and ruin their chance. The men began to notice something was wrong. Their laughter and shouting turned into confusion. "Where did she go?" one of them barked, pointing toward the canyon walls. Panic crept into their voices, a sound unfamiliar to Nayeli. She realized that Elias had not only freed her but had given them an advantage by keeping the captors off balance. Her hope strengthened as they moved steadily toward safety. Elias and Nayeli worked as a team, each relying on the other. Nayeli's knowledge of the land was invaluable. She knew which paths were stable, which rocks could be trusted for footing, and which shadows could hide them from view. Elias's experience in strategy and observation complemented her skills perfectly. Together, they moved with a sense of silent coordination, the desert around them alive with tension and anticipation. The men, realizing they had lost control, began to pursue, but the terrain now worked against them. The canyon walls narrowed in some places and opened in others, creating natural barriers and bottlenecks. Elias used these features expertly, guiding Nayeli through paths that would slow the men down and give them more advantage. Each turn of the canyon felt like a test, each shadow a potential refuge. As they reached a small clearing, Elias paused briefly to scan the path ahead. The men were gaining, but they were disorganized, their earlier confidence replaced with frustration and panic. Elias spotted a small ledge that led to higher ground, difficult to access but offering safety if they could reach it. He motioned for Nayeli to follow, moving carefully to ensure that the men could not see their path. Nayeli climbed with care, her hands gripping the rough stone, her feet finding each small foothold. Elias followed, his movements steady and precise. They reached the top of the ledge, pausing to catch their breath. From here, they had a clear view of the wagon below and the men struggling to regain control. Nayeli's heart pounded, but she felt a sense of triumph. They had escaped the immediate danger, but they were not entirely safe yet. Elias whispered, "We need to make sure they don't follow us." He looked around, spotting a narrow trail that wound through rocks and low brush, perfect for concealing their movements. Nayeli nodded, following him quietly. They moved quickly, but carefully, using the shadows and the terrain to their advantage. The desert, which had seemed so vast and empty before, now provided the tools they needed to protect themselves. The men below, frustrated and humiliated by their failure, shouted and gestured, but it was too late. Nayeli and Elias had disappeared from sight. The canyon, once a trap, had become a shield. Nayeli felt a rush of relief and gratitude, though she said nothing. She understood that Elias had risked his own safety to help her, and that alone spoke volumes. His quiet courage had made the difference. As they continued along the trail, Nayeli and Elias began to relax slightly, though they remained alert. The desert was still full of unknown dangers, but the immediate threat had passed. Nayeli's mind raced with thoughts of her village, wondering how they were reacting to the events she had narrowly escaped. Elias remained calm, his focus on the path ahead, his quiet presence reassuring her as they moved forward. By the time they reached a safe vantage point overlooking the open plains, the men had given up pursuit. Nayeli breathed deeply, feeling the tension leave her body in slow waves. She looked at Elias, who stood silently, scanning the horizon. Despite his quiet nature, there was a strength in him that was undeniable. A strength built not on weapons or intimidation, but on courage, intelligence, and a deep sense of right and wrong. Nayeli finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you," she said. Elias only nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. He didn't need words. The act itself was enough. Nayeli realized that heroes were not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes, they were quiet, steady people who acted when it mattered most. The two of them stayed there for a while, watching the desert stretch endlessly before them. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Nayeli felt a sense of hope returning, a belief that even in a harsh and unforgiving world, courage and kindness could prevail. Elias's intervention had changed everything, not just for her, but for the message it sent to others. That injustice could be challenged, and that courage often comes from the most unexpected places. As the day ended, Nayeli and Elias began the slow journey back toward her village. The path was still long, but each step was lighter than before. They moved together, allies bound not by obligation but by shared experience. In the quiet of the desert evening, it became clear that their encounter would be remembered not only for the danger they had faced but for the courage, intelligence, and compassion that had turned fear into safety.